The champagne glass slipped from a waiter's hand and shattered against the marble floor. For half a second the orchestra faltered. The chandelier's crystal light bounced across the room, cutting the laughter into shards. 300 guests in gowns and tuxedos turned their heads, and in the middle of it all, my daughter-in-law Cassie Sterling raised her manicured finger and pointed directly at me. "This is the fat pig we'll all endure." The words did not fall quietly. They cracked through the grand ballroom like a whip. The guests gasped, then laughed an ugly rolling laugh that spread like a disease. Their jeweled necks shook, champagne foamed at the edges of crystal flutes, and a few young men slapped each other's backs as if cruelty were sport. I stood still. The laughter around me turned to silence inside me. It was as if someone had pressed mute on my heart. My breath caught my chest, tightened. I was no longer 68 years old in that moment. I was a girl again, singled out on the playground, mocked for the body that never quite fit. Only now, instead of children, it was senators, CEOs, and sterling family friends wearing designer gowns worth more than my car. Cassie's smile was venom dressed as charm. She leaned against my son Daniel, her new husband, and the emeralds at her neck flickered under the chandeliers. Daniel's face flushed with confusion, then with shame. He did not speak. The sound of laughter swirled around me. I lifted my eyes. Across the dance floor, Richard Sterling, Cassie's father, the patriarch of this spectacle, was pouring himself a glass of Bordeaux. His hand trembled. He froze mid-pour. The color drained from his face. His lips parted as if the name had escaped him. Eleanor Whitmore. He did not shout it, but I saw his eyes widen, pupils dilating like a man seeing a ghost. He knew me. The same man who had strutted through boardrooms, who had bought companies and sold futures, now stood staring as if the marble under his feet had cracked open. The wine in his glass rippled. He clutched the stem with both hands to keep it from spilling. His glass rippled in his shaking hands. His eyes widened, pupils dilating, and the practiced grin he wore all evening collapsed. He clutched the stem tighter, as though the recognition itself had weight when his $80 million empire changed hands. He recognized me as the one who signed the papers, the one who watched as he surrendered his company. The guests kept laughing blind to the crack opening under Richard's feet. He swallowed hard. He tried to compose himself, but his eyes never left mine. His glass trembled. The chandelier light flashed across his lenses, and for a second he looked far older than the man who had greeted me earlier that evening, with a practiced politician's grin. My ears buzzed. My heart whispered, "Stay silent, stay invisible." That was my rule for 15 years. Michael and I had built our fortune on invisibility, on discretion, on never letting the world know what we truly held. But humiliation has a strange taste. It burns the throat like whiskey, then turns sweet like justice, waiting to ripen. The laughter pressed in again. I caught snippets. Pig, how embarrassing, poor Daniel. My cheeks warmed, but I did not lower my head. I lifted my chin the way Michael once told me, "Never bow to a crowd that delights in cruelty." My mind flickered back. A rainy night years ago. Michael closing my hand over a small envelope with a brass key inside, his voice low, "Promise me, never let them know." The memory echoed with the clink of that silver teacup spoon, circling slow. That was the second time the motif returned, anchoring me. I looked at Cassie. She thought she had crushed me. She thought she had made herself the star of the evening. Her finger still hovered, her laugh high-pitched, as she tugged at Daniel's arm to make him join. But Daniel's eyes were on the floor, not on me. He had no words. Richard, though, had no laughter left in him. He set the wine down so abruptly, it splashed. His knuckles whitened, and in that instant the balance of the night shifted, not in the room at large, not for the 300 spectators, but between him and me. He knew. The insults still rang in the air, but his face drained of blood. His lips parted not in laughter, but in dread, as if every share, every signature he'd once surrendered had returned to haunt him in my gaze. He knew the mockery had cut deeper than anyone else realized, because the target of their laughter was the very person he had been trying to forget since the day he signed away his company. I met his gaze. I did not nod. I did not speak. I let silence answer, a silence heavier than any laugh. And that silence wrapped around Richard Sterling like a noose. The orchestra resumed violins, hesitant, as if unsure the humiliation had passed. Guests clinked glasses again awkwardly. But Richard did not move. He stood frozen, staring at me with the face of a man caught between recognition and dread. In that suspended moment, I felt Michael's presence again. I imagined the steam rising from his tea, the silver rim of the cup glinting. His voice echoed, "Patience, Eleanor. Patience turns wounds into weapons." That was the third time the motif surfaced, planted, recalled, and now harvested, pulling me back to center. I breathed deeply. I straightened my shoulders. I was no pig. I was no embarrassment. I was Eleanor Whitmore. And Richard Sterling had just remembered the truth. The camera in my mind cut sharply on his eyes wide glass, trembling sweat forming at his temple. The eyes of a man who realized the past he tried to bury had just walked into his daughter's wedding. Fade to black. Rain hammered the windows, drowning Michael's words in its fury. The storm had swallowed the city in darkness. Streetlights flickered like candles on the verge of surrender. Inside our small study, the lamp glowed low, casting amber shadows across Michael's tired face. He reached into his jacket pocket, his hand trembling in a way I had never seen before. Michael was never the type to tremble. He was a man who had built empires on calm calculation, who never let anyone see fear. Yet that night in the chorus of thunder, his hand shook as he pulled out a small envelope. He pressed it into my palm. The paper was damp, softened at the edges. Inside, I felt the outline of a single brass key. "Promise me." He whispered, his voice rough from years of long nights and longer battles never let them know. His eyes burned into mine. Not with anger, not with desperation, with a truth too heavy for one man to carry. I wanted to speak, to ask questions. Who? Why? What could be so dangerous? But the thunder silenced me. I only nodded. My fingers curled around the envelope. The weight of that key seemed larger than the storm outside. Michael sank into his chair, exhaling as though the act of handing it over had stolen his strength. The leather groaned under his weight. He closed his eyes, then reached for his silver teacup, the one with the faint dent along the rim from years of use. He stirred his tea slowly. The spoon clinked against the cup in a rhythm steady and calm. Clink, clink, clink. That sound became music, a lullaby to anchor me in the chaos. I remembered the first time he had bought that cup for me on our anniversary trip to Boston. He had told me that silver carried memory better than gold. Gold shines, but silver remembers, he said, smiling as he set the cup in my hands. And now, years later, the silver teacup was not just a keepsake. It was the drumbeat of our secret. I opened the envelope again in the lamplight. The brass key glowed faintly wet from the storm air. Michael's hand covered mine, pressing it closed once more. "That key," he said, voice low, "opens more than a box. It opens the life we built. Everything we poured into it, every risk, every sacrifice. If anyone else finds it, it becomes a weapon. In your hands, it's protection." I could feel the storm shaking the glass panes, but inside me, a storm was building stronger. I wanted to beg him to explain, to put the burden back on his shoulders. But the look in his eyes was final. He had already decided. The ledger, the accounts, the truth of our years, now they belonged to me. He pulled the leather-bound ledger from the drawer and slid it across the desk. Its spine was worn, its corners bent, the smell of ink and paper filling the room. Inside, neat columns stretched across the pages. Investments, acquisitions, debts, repaid, favors owed. Every dollar accounted for. Every thread of our empire documented in his precise handwriting. This, he said, tapping the book with one finger, is the map, not to wealth, but to power. Money is nothing without knowledge of where it flows. This tells you who can be trusted and who will betray you. I traced the lines of his writing, each number like a heartbeat. I remembered long nights when he came home smelling of rain and tobacco, sitting at that very desk bent over those columns. I had thought it was simple accounting, but it was more. It was the record of his faith in a future he might never see. The storm cracked overhead. Lightning lit up the room in blue. For a second, Michael's face looked almost translucent, fragile, in a way I had never wanted to see. He took my hand again. Keep your power silent, Eleanor, until the world forces you to reveal it. His words carved themselves into me, a foreshadowing I didn't yet understand. At the time, it sounded like philosophy. Tonight, I know it was prophecy. I remember arguing softly, almost childlike, "Why me? You're stronger. You know how to fight them." He shook his head. "Because they expect me. They never expect you. That's where our strength lies, in what they can't imagine." The spoon struck the silver cup again. Clink. A reminder that patience was stronger than fury. I stared at the key in my palm until the brass imprint left a mark on my skin. The rain outside beat harder, as if time itself wanted to hammer the truth into me. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at his desk, with the ledger open, turning pages, slowly memorizing the rhythm of his writing, the way he layered trust and caution, side by side. I found notes in the margins, small phrases he had never spoken aloud. Check sterling, deal too much risk. Watch R, over coffee. Eyes lie. Cassie's father playing too fast. Yes, his suspicion of Richard Sterling had begun years before. Even then, Michael had sensed the empire Richard built was hollow, propped up by borrowed confidence. I traced that name with my finger. Sterling. I didn't know then how much it would matter. I only felt the weight of his caution. Hours passed. The storm faded into dawn. Michael had fallen asleep in his chair, hands still resting on the ledger. I watched him breathe, chest rising and falling slowly, the silver teacup empty beside him. I held the key tighter. My promise echoed louder than the rain. Never let them know. That night sealed my fate. The brass key, the leather ledger, the silver teacup, 3 ordinary objects that together became the pillars of my life. They were not wealth alone. They were memory, caution, and power disguised as fragility. When Michael passed away 2 years later, those objects became my anchor. People looked at me and saw a widow. They did not see the key hidden in my dresser, the ledger wrapped in linen, the teacup polished and waiting. And when Richard Sterling stood frozen in that ballroom, staring at me as though he had seen a ghost, I knew the storm from that night had not ended. It had only been waiting. Boss? The word slipped out of Richard Sterling's mouth like a secret escaping chains, barely more than a breath, but sharp enough to slice through the velvet hum of the ballroom. I was standing no more than 10 feet away when I heard it. His hand trembled as he poured Bordeaux into a crystal glass. The wine wobbled, spilled onto the white tablecloth in a thin bleeding arc. His knuckles whitened. He gripped the bottle too tight, as though strangling it would erase the truth. He wasn't looking at the glass. He was looking at me. I should have turned away. I should have let the laughter of the crowd wash over me, pretended not to notice. That was my survival rule: silence, invisibility, patience. But Richard's eyes pinned me like an insect to glass. He had seen me once before, across a boardroom table, when his empire was slipping from his hands. That memory had returned now, alive in his trembling jaw, in the way his lips formed that single word, boss. And he wasn't the only one who heard it. A waitress passed with a tray of flutes, her hair pulled back, her steps light on the marble. She slowed as the word hit her ears. Julia. Her name was stitched neatly on her apron. Young, maybe 20, but quick. She glanced between us, eyes narrowing, as if storing away the moment. In a ballroom full of noise and light, that one whisper had found an audience it was never meant to have. I felt my stomach tighten. Secrets are fragile things. Once spoken, they multiply. Julia looked at Richard, then at me, curiosity flickering in her face. She didn't know what she'd overheard. Not yet. But I knew the danger. Once a seed of doubt takes root, it grows. Richard tried to recover. He straightened his tie, lifted the glass, but his hand shook too hard. Red wine dripped onto the marble floor, staining it like blood. He cursed under his breath, too low for the crowd, but I heard. I tried to avert my eyes. I tried to slip back into the crowd, to blend into the blur of sequins and tuxedos. But his gaze locked me in place. For 15 years I had mastered the art of being overlooked. Tonight, that art was crumbling under one man's stare. My chest rose and fell faster. I reminded myself of Michael's words, "Keep your power silent until the world forces you to reveal it." This wasn't the time, not yet. But Richard's eyes said he would not let me go. He set the glass down with a sharp clink, too forceful, startling Julia. She moved quickly, wiping at the spill, but her eyes never stopped flicking between us. She was already a witness. Richard's face shone with sweat under the chandelier's glare. His lips trembled as he mouthed the word again, quieter this time. "Boss." I shook my head slightly. A warning. A plea for him to stay silent. But he didn't. He moved through the crowd like a man possessed, brushing aside hands that tried to stop him, ignoring congratulations, ignoring the music. He reached me in 3 long strides. His hand clamped down on my wrist. The pressure was firm, almost desperate. His palm was damp, slick with sweat. "Not here," he muttered, his voice low and uneven. "We need to talk." My instincts screamed to pull away. The entire ballroom was still laughing, drinking, twirling to music, oblivious to the storm boiling between us. But Julia stood nearby, tray against her hip, pretending to focus on the spilled wine. Her ears were burning red. She had heard. She was listening. I felt the silver teacup in my memory again, the spoon circling slow. "Patience, Eleanor." The motif steadied me, reminded me not to flinch. I did not answer Richard. I only let him hold my wrist long enough for Julia to see, long enough for the look on his face to betray itself. Then, as quietly as possible, I allowed him to lead me away from the chandeliers, away from the laughter, down a corridor lined with gilt-framed portraits. Each step echoed like a drum. The smell of roses and spilled champagne clung to the air. My pulse hammered in my throat. We stopped at a side room, a parlor lit by a single lamp. The door clicked shut behind us. The laughter of the ballroom became a muffled roar beyond the walls. Richard released my wrist, but his hand trembled so violently he had to grip the back of a chair to steady himself. His face was pale beads of sweat gathering at his temples. His chest rose and fell with short, shallow breaths. "You." He struggled to form words. "You weren't supposed to be here. Not you. Not her mother." I said nothing. My silence was louder than any accusation. He wiped his forehead with a handkerchief, eyes darting like a cornered animal. "If they find out, if Cassie finds out, everything falls apart." His voice cracked, the last fragments of his confidence breaking. I stood still, hands folded in front of me, letting the silence stretch, letting it bind him tighter. He had pulled me into this room thinking he could control the moment. But already his sweat, his panic, his whisper had turned him into prey. And I knew Julia, with her sharp ears and sharper memory, had heard more than enough to become part of this story. The chandelier light from the hall spilled a faint glow through the doorframe, painting Richard's shadow across the carpet. His shoulders hunched as though the weight of everything he feared had suddenly landed on his back. That was how Chapter 3 ended for me. Not with triumph, not with words, but with the sight of Richard Sterling's sweat-drenched face, as he realized the one person he thought he had humiliated now held the power to unmake him. Cliffhanger. His hand gripped my arm again tighter, this time, voice barely a whisper. Please. Not here. The silence answered for me. Please. Richard's voice cracked. His hands still clamped around my wrist, slick with sweat, his eyes darting to the closed door, as though the crowd outside might burst in at any moment. You can't let them know. Not here. Not tonight. His desperation bled through the polished shell he had worn for decades. The titan of Sterling Holdings was gone. In his place stood a man stripped raw begging in the shadows of his daughter's $500,000 wedding. I inhaled slowly, the sound steady against his ragged breath. The weight of his grip pressed into my skin, but I did not pull away. Instead, I looked at him, the way Michael once looked at opponents across the negotiation table, patient, silent, waiting for them to crumble under the weight of their own fear. The silver teacup appeared again in my mind, the faint ring of the spoon against porcelain. Clink, clink, clink. Patience was the rhythm. I've lost enough, Richard whispered. Don't make me lose her too. Cassie doesn't know. She can't know. The irony tightened my chest. His daughter had humiliated me in front of 300 guests, laughing as if my existence were an inconvenience to endure. And here was her father voice breaking, terrified that the truth would humiliate him in return. The ballroom noise seeped faintly through the door violins, laughter, the clink of glasses. Life continued outside, oblivious to the storm in this room. Then the door opened a crack. Cassie's voice slid in, sugar laced with venom. Father, what are you doing in here? With her, Richard jolted, releasing my wrist too quickly. I rubbed the red mark where his hand had been. Cassie stepped into the room, Emerald's glittering gown, trailing silk across the carpet. Her lips curled in that same smirk she had used when she pointed at me on the dance floor. She looked at her father, then at me. I hope she isn't causing trouble. After all, pigs don't belong in parlors, do they? Her laugh was sharp, practiced, designed to wound. Richard flinched. He raised a hand as if to quiet her. Cassie, stop. But she didn't. She leaned back against the doorframe, enjoying the power she thought she held. Honestly, I don't know why Daniel even let her come. This whole night is supposed to be about us, not about whatever she is. I exhaled. My chest rose, my breath steady but deliberate. Cassie's words stabbed, but they no longer cut as deep. Not after Richard's whisper, not after his plea, because I knew the truth he was desperate to hide. Richard turned to me again, his face damp, his lips trembling. Please, Eleanor, I'll do anything. Just not here. Cassie's eyes narrowed. Do anything? What are you talking about? She stepped closer, suspicion creeping into her smile. She looked between us, sensing something had shifted. The silence stretched heavy and unyielding. My heart beat slow, strong. Michael's voice echoed. Keep your power silent until the world forces you to reveal it. The world was forcing me now. I lifted my chin, my eyes locked on Richard's, then slid deliberately to Cassie. I let the silence stretch one breath longer until her smirk flickered with doubt, until Richard's chest heaved with panic, until Julia's face flashed across my mind, her sharp ears, her watchful eyes. She had heard enough to ensure this truth would not stay buried. My throat felt dry, but my voice when it came was steady. Each word landed like steel against marble. You mocked me. I own you. 6 words. They dropped into the room with the force of a gavel. Richard staggered back, gripping the chair for balance. His face drained of color, sweat glistening under the dim lamp. His lips opened, but no sound came out. Cassie froze. Her smirk collapsed into confusion. What? What do you mean I did not answer her question? I didn't need to. The weight of my words had already shifted the ground beneath her. For the first time that night, she looked unsure. Her bravado faltered. She turned to her father for explanation, but he avoided her gaze, shoulders collapsing inward. The silence became a wall between us stronger than any argument. I thought again of the silver teacup sitting polished in my home waiting, the clink of the spoon, the patience it symbolized. Tonight, patience had bloomed into power. Outside the orchestra swelled violins, soaring oblivious to the revolution taking place behind this closed door. Cassie's voice cracked thinner than before. "Father." "What is she talking about?" Richard pressed the handkerchief to his forehead. His silence spoke louder than words. I stepped forward only enough to let the lamplight catch my face. Calm, unshaken, resolute. Power had shifted. For years I had been invisible. Tonight, 6 words had torn the veil away. "You mocked me. I own you." The echo of those words filled the parlor, louder than the laughter outside, louder than the storm of the past. And in Richard's dead stare, in Cassie's faltering smile, I saw it clearly, the first crack in their empire, the first fracture that would bring everything down. The cliffhanger was written in sweat on Richard's brow, in the tremble of his hands, in the silence that swallowed his daughter's question. The shift had begun. The night after the wedding, I sat alone at my kitchen table, the silver teacup resting near my hand. I stirred once. The spoon tapped against porcelain. Clink. The sound cut through the silence like a metronome for secrets. Richard's face still hovered in my mind, pale, slick with sweat, when I said the 6 words that shattered his certainty. But shock was not victory. It was only the beginning. And I knew Cassie would not stay quiet. She was too ambitious, too hungry. By dawn, I had already called Marcus Hale. He had been my lawyer for over a decade, the kind of man who wore his caution like a second skin. When I told him we needed to meet immediately, he didn't ask why. He just said, "Office. 9 sharp." I arrived early. His downtown suite smelled of polished wood and cold coffee. Documents were stacked like battlements across his desk. He didn't greet me with pleasantries. He simply slid a folder toward me. "Sterling," he said. "They're moving fast." Inside were clipped notes, preliminary reports. Cassie had already retained a private investigator, someone with a reputation for digging deeper than most. My throat tightened when I saw the attached photo, grainy but recognizable. It was me. Not now. Not Eleanor Whitmore, the widow with her modest apartment and quiet car. No, this was a photograph from years ago, half hidden behind lawyers at the signing table, my navy dress just visible. My posture, my face turned slightly to the side. Enough for anyone with patience to connect the dots. I stared at it until my pulse hammered in my ears. "Where did this come from?" Marcus steepled his fingers. The PI pulled it from archived business journals. "They're close, Eleanor. Too close. If they tie this to you, the structure falls apart." I pressed a hand flat against the cool wood of his desk. "Then we erase it." He nodded once. "I'll reach out to our contact at the archive. But this isn't just about one image. If they know where to look, there will be others. Court records, shell filings. You've built a fortress, but Cassie is pushing at the gates." I left his office with the weight of inevitability pressing my shoulders. That evening, I drove to meet David Rourke, the retired inspector, who still carried himself like he had a badge pinned to his chest. He owed me favors, and more importantly, he respected discretion. We sat in a corner booth of a diner no one important would visit. His plate of eggs cooled untouched as I laid out what I needed: surveillance, background checks, receipts. I wanted every move Cassie and Richard made, documented, time-stamped, undeniable. "Eleanor," he said, "leaning in this isn't just paranoia, is it?" "No," I answered. "It's survival." He studied me for a long moment, then scribbled a note in his battered pad. "I'll get you what you need, but you'd better be ready. Once I dig, I don't stop until I hit bedrock." "Good," I said. My voice surprised me. Low, steady, colder than the coffee in his cup. By the time I returned home, exhaustion gnawed at my bones. I dropped my bag, reached for the teacup. The spoon chimed again as I stirred. Clink. A fragile sound in a room full of shadows. I opened Michael's old ledger, the one we had kept locked away for years. Page after page of careful notes investments charted like a map of patience. He had once told me, on a night of rain and thunder, promise me never let them know. His handwriting bled across the page now, like a ghost, warning me that the promise was about to be tested. The phone buzzed. Marcus again. They almost got it, he said. His voice was tight. Your photo's been circulating among Sterling's inner circle. I had it pulled. Our contact buried the archive deeper, but Eleanor, this was a close call. I closed my eyes. For a moment, I saw everything collapsing. The trust, the companies, the careful shell. 15 years of silence, turning to ash in an instant. How long do we have, I asked. That depends. If they push harder, maybe weeks. If they stumble, months. But you need to move everything into the Delaware Trust now. It's the only wall high enough. So I did. For the next 3 days, I signed papers until my hand cramped. We rerouted accounts, reassigned properties, tucked assets behind layers of law, so dense even regulators would grow tired before reaching the center. Each signature was another brick, another lock on the vault that held my life's work. But beneath it all, the truth remained. If they connected me to that photograph, the fortress could still crack. That night, as rain pattered against the window, I sat again with the teacup. The silver caught the dim light, a reminder of patience, and of Michael's steady hand. But patience alone would not be enough anymore. I had to act. So I turned the ledger around, began writing in a new column. Names, dates, transactions tied to Richard Sterling, consulting fees, board stipends, loans disguised as partnerships. With David Rourke's information, I could trace every thread of their web. And when the time came, I would pull. The spoon struck the porcelain one final time. Clink. In that sound, I understood Cassie thought she was hunting me. But she didn't realize I had already started hunting her. If I slipped, if even one receipt remained in their hands, everything would collapse. But if I held steady, if I gathered every thread, then when the web finally snapped, it would not be mine. It would be theirs. And the world would see who truly owned who. By morning, I was invisible again. I drove the old sedan that coughed whenever I turned the ignition. The seatbelt scraped against my coat. At the grocery store, no one looked twice at me. I chose bruised apples, counted coupons, and carried my bags with quiet hands. To the clerk, I was just another widow stretching her pension. That was the mask. And I wore it well. But when night settled and the city hummed under neon, I shed that skin. The desk in my study became a command post. Files opened like wings across the wood. Screens flickered with numbers climbing and falling. The silver teacup sat at the edge, reflecting faint light, the spoon inside a silent metronome. Each time I stirred it, I reminded myself patience first, then precision. By midnight, I was no longer the widow with coupons. I was the silent hand behind 4 shell companies, the architect of a $420 million fund. I signed contracts, through intermediaries, moved capital like pieces on a chessboard, shifted shares into holdings that looped through Delaware and back again. I never bragged. I never showed. Silence was my currency, and every dollar obeyed. Still, silence carried its weight, and that weight pressed harder whenever Daniel's name lit my phone. My son. My blood. The only bridge between me and the family that had humiliated me. Daniel was a surgeon. His hands could steady a scalpel through a trembling artery. But when it came to me and Cassie, those hands shook. That evening, after I had wired funds through 2 intermediaries, he called. The sound of the hospital corridor echoed in the background. Intercom's hurried shoes, the beep of machines. "Mom," he said, weary. "Can we talk?" My chest tightened. Of course. He sighed into the receiver. Cassie thinks you're interfering. She says you embarrassed Dad at the wedding, that you threatened him. I let the silence hang. The hum of fluorescent light filled my study. I lifted the teacup, stirred once. Clink. Did I? I asked softly. His breath caught. He wasn't used to me answering with questions. I don't know anymore, he admitted. I owe you everything. You paid my tuition when I couldn't get the loans. You worked double shifts just so I could stand in that operating room. Every time I cut into someone's chest, I remember that. But Cassie, she's my wife. I can't just... His voice cracked. I can't choose. My hand tightened around the cup. I remembered those years. Nights bent over invoices, sewing hems until my fingers bled, while Daniel studied in light I could barely afford. I never asked for repayment. I only asked that he live with integrity. Daniel, I said, steady. You don't have to choose, but you do have to see. Cassie laughs now, but laughter turns to claws when it's threatened. You'll see who she is soon enough, he whispered. And if you're wrong, I let the spoon fall back into the cup. The sound rang sharp. Clink. Then you'll know I carried the burden for nothing, I answered. Silence stretched. Finally, he said, I don't want to lose either of you. I closed the ledger. My eyes burned, but no tears came. You already lost something, Daniel. You just don't know it yet. The line went dead. I sat there, hands trembling against the porcelain. The teacup trembled too, catching the light like it might shatter. Cassie had drawn him into her orbit, wrapped him in silk and venom. But the debt of his life, his very career, tied him to me. Gratitude and love pulling one way, loyalty and desire pulling the other. And I knew that tearing was only beginning. Near dawn, I shut down the screens, locked the files. The city outside stirred awake with delivery trucks and early commuters. I slipped back into the mask of the widow coat, buttoned hair, pinned silence worn like armor. At the grocery store again, I smiled faintly at the cashier, who barely noticed me. Bags in hand, I shuffled to the sedan. To the world, I was nothing more than an old woman fighting to stay afloat. But beneath my coat, I carried signatures worth hundreds of millions. Beneath my silence, I carried receipts sharp enough to bleed an empire dry. 2 faces, 1 body. And with each stir of the silver teacup, I reminded myself the world saw only one. The moment I stepped into the conference room, I knew it wasn't a family gathering. It was an ambush, dressed in polished wood and leather chairs. The long mahogany table gleamed beneath the overhead lights. At one end sat Richard. His suit pressed his tie too tight against the bulge of his throat. Beside him, Cassie smiled like a cat about to corner a bird. Daniel lingered a step behind her eyes, tired jaw set in silence. Mother Richard said, gesturing to the empty chair at the far end, we thought it time to discuss the family trust, for everyone's future. I lowered myself into the chair, my hands folded neatly on the table. The silver teacup existed only in my memory, but I felt it there, steady, reminding me to breathe. Cassie leaned forward, papers stacked before her. We want you to contribute 20 million into the family trust, she said brightly, as though she were offering me dessert. It's only fair that we pool resources. Unity makes us stronger. I didn't answer. Silence has its own gravity. Richard cleared his throat. Surely you understand. With your resources, it's a modest contribution. For Daniel, for Lily, for generations to come. Cassie's nails tapped the folder in front of her. Then with a dramatic pause, she slid a document across the table. And in case you hesitate, Eleanor, she said, we found something. The paper stopped in front of me. An account statement. Offshore, Cayman Islands. My name typed clean across the top. For a heartbeat, the room narrowed to the sound of my pulse. Daniel shifted his gaze, snapping toward me. This, Cassie said, her voice sweetened with venom, proves you've hidden money offshore. The family deserves transparency. If you don't contribute well. She let the threat hang. Someone might ask why you've kept this secret. Every eye turned toward me. Richard's grin widened, sensing victory. Daniel's hands clenched into fists, waiting. I lifted the paper slowly, studying the neat lines of type. A forgery, yes, but convincing enough to fool a crowd that wanted to believe. My chest rose, once then fell. I let the silence stretch until even the hum of the air conditioner grew loud. Inside, I pictured the silver teacup. I stirred it once in my mind. Clink. Patience first, precision after. Then Marcus moved. He had sat at my side quietly, a shadow in a grey suit, eyes unreadable. Now he opened his briefcase and drew out a file thicker than Cassie's. He set it down with a heavy thud that echoed in the still room. Before we accuse Mrs. Whitmore of impropriety, Marcus said evenly, "Perhaps we should examine Mr. Sterling's own dealings." Richard's smirk faltered. Marcus flipped open the file. Pages rustled like the turning of knives. For the past 5 years, Richard Sterling has accepted $2.5 million annually in consulting fees. He tapped the page. From a company owned by Mrs. Whitmore. That would be my client. The words dropped like stones into water. Daniel's face drained of color. Cassie blinked, once twice the veneer of control slipping. Richard opened his mouth, closed it, then reached for his glass as though whiskey could erase the evidence. "This is absurd," he began. Marcus slid a second document across the table, this one stamped and notarized. Absurd or verifiable. The transfer's a public record, unless, of course, you'd like me to read the routing numbers aloud. The room froze. Even Cassie's nails stilled on the tabletop. I leaned back in my chair, the forged account statement still between my fingers. "You mocked me," I said softly. "And you thought this would corner me." I let the paper fall back to the table with a whisper. "But you forgot who signs your checks." Richard's face collapsed inward. His shoulders sagged, his eyes darting to Daniel for support. But my son looked away. Cassie's mouth opened, desperate for a counterstrike, but no words came. She had built her trap on a counterfeit foundation, and it had crumbled in front of everyone. Power shifted in that moment. The tide rolled back to me, silent but unstoppable. I reached for the glass of water at my side. My hand was steady. If this meeting was meant to expose me, I said then, consider it a lesson. Truth always has receipts. Lies only have paper. I rose, gathering my coat with deliberate calm. Marcus closed his briefcase, his gaze never leaving Richard's defeated eyes. As I walked out, I pictured again the silver teacup waiting at home. Tonight, when I stirred it, the sound would not be for patience. It would be for victory. Because once again, the ones who sought to shame me had shamed themselves. The chandelier light caught the rim of my glass as I stepped into the grand ballroom. The gala was in full bloom. Crystal flutes, raised gowns, swaying a string quartet, pushing air heavy with triumph. On stage, Richard Sterling lifted his arms like a conquering king. His voice carried over the crowd of 300. "Ladies and gentlemen, the empire is still strong, stronger than ever." The audience erupted in applause. Silver forks clinked against porcelain champagne, hissed in flutes. For a moment, the man who had tried to corner me seemed untouchable, draped in adoration, but empires rot from the inside. And tonight, the rot would show. I moved through the crowd, Marcus at my side, Julia just behind. She clutched the slim black case that held the USB. Her knuckles were white, but her eyes never left me. She knew the part she played, and she would not falter. Richard's gaze found mine mid-sentence. His lips froze, words catching on his tongue. A flicker of fear shadowed his bravado. Mr. Sterling Marcus's voice rang out calm yet sharp, carrying across the hall. "Before you crown yourself with false glory, perhaps the guests deserve the truth." The room shifted. Murmurs swelled like a storm tide. Cassie, radiant in her sequined gown, shot forward, her smile strained. "This is a celebration, not a courtroom." Marcus didn't flinch. He nodded to Julia. She set the USB into the projector. The screen behind Richard flickered alive. Numbers transfer signatures filled the wall in stark black and white. Consulting fees, shell accounts, receipts like scars carved into paper. Gasps cut through the hall. Forks clattered to plates. And then the recording. Richard's voice, rough with arrogance, played through the speakers. "As long as the old widow doesn't know, we'll bleed her clean." The crowd recoiled. Chairs scraped. A woman covered her mouth with her hands. Cassie shrieked, "This is fabricated." Her voice cracked under the weight of the evidence. The doors swung wide. Uniformed officers entered their presence, heavy as judgment. They walked with measured steps, no haste, no hesitation. "Richard Sterling," one officer announced. "You're under arrest." The applause of minutes ago turned to stunned silence. Richard's face drained of color. Sweat beaded his forehead. When the cold steel closed around his wrists, the ballroom exhaled a collective gasp. 300 pairs of eyes watched as the empire's patriarch was led away shackled under the chandelier. Cassie lunged, screaming his name. Her heels clattered against the marble. She clawed at the officers until one raised a hand warning her back. She collapsed against the stage, her sobs raw, tearing through the quiet. The crowd shifted uneasily. Men loosened their ties, women clutched their pearls. The empire that had seemed eternal just moments ago now lay exposed, brittle, broken. I stood still, hands folded at my waist. No smile, no triumph painted across my face. Inside my coat pocket, my fingers brushed the cool curve of the silver teacup I had carried with me, a relic wrapped in cloth. The music had stilled. The piano's final chord hung in the air unfinished. I touched the teacup once, not to celebrate, to remind myself. Michael's voice lingered like a ghost. "Keep your power silent until the world forces you to reveal it." Tonight, the world had forced it, and I had revealed just enough. As Richard disappeared through the doors, and Cassie's cries echoed against the marble, I let the silence settle over me. It was not the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of control, of patience rewarded. The chandelier sparkled above, but I kept my eyes low, my footsteps quiet. Because victory, if shouted, loses its strength. And I wanted mine to last. The empire crumbled faster than anyone expected. Within weeks of Richard's arrest, headlines painted their downfall in bold ink. Sterling family assets frozen. Consulting fraud investigated. Their empire, once worth 80 million, became nothing more than seized accounts and shuttered doors. The $8 million mansion, with its manicured lawns and fountains that danced to hidden music, went first. Auctioneers paraded through its halls, voices echoing against marble floors as they tagged chandeliers and carved mantels. When the gavel struck, it was no longer theirs. Cassie and Daniel moved into a rented apartment. Beige walls, thin carpet, a balcony that faced an alley instead of the ocean. Vanity reduced to drywall and shadows. By the time Thanksgiving arrived, the air around them had already soured. Daniel called me that morning. His voice was brittle like glass under strain. "Mom, will you come?" I paused, my hand resting on the silver teacup I had polished earlier. "Are you sure Cassie wants me there?" Silence stretched. Then softly, "Please." So I went. The apartment smelled faintly of boiled potatoes. No turkey aromas, no cinnamon pies cooling on counters. Just the metallic tang of a stove that had seen better days. The table was set with mismatched plates. A bowl of canned green beans. A half loaf of bread. Cold cuts arranged as if they could pass for celebration. Cassie sat stiffly at the end of the table, wrapped in a coat she hadn't bothered to remove. Once sequins and silk, now polyester, frayed at the cuffs. Her eyes darted to me but never stayed. Daniel pulled out a chair. Mum. I sat. The wood beneath me was scratched, scarred, from years in someone else's home before it became theirs. My fingers brushed the surface. I set the silver teacup down with quiet precision. The sound was soft, but it filled the room. Cassie flinched. Daniel shifted uneasily, glancing between us. Let's eat. We passed plates. The bread tore unevenly. The beans slid cold onto porcelain. Cassie's hands shook when she lifted her fork. I studied her in silence. The woman who had once laughed as a ballroom mocked me now sat in borrowed light, stripped of glitter. She didn't meet my eyes. Not once. Finally I spoke. My voice was calm, low, a whisper against the hollow of the room. You had turkey. She had frostbite. The words landed heavier than any shouting could. Daniel froze fork midway to his mouth. Cassie's lips parted, but no sound came. Her shoulders curled inward, as though the weight of her choices pressed her down at last. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. Inside, silence thickened, broken only by the scrape of utensils. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The teacup gleamed on the scarred wood, a relic of patience, a mirror to the ruin around us. Cassie finally set her fork down. She stared at her plate, breathing shallow. For the first time, she had no words to spit, no venom to spill. Daniel's gaze flicked toward me, searching for anger, but he found none. Only the calm of someone who had endured, who had waited, who had let the truth reveal itself without force. He swallowed hard. Mum. His voice cracked, but he said nothing more. I lifted the teacup, let the spoon strike once. Clink. The sound was clear, final. In that moment, the education was complete. Not through courtrooms, not through headlines, but through the silence of a ruined Thanksgiving table. I sipped the tea slowly. It tasted of ashes and patience, and I left them with both. Family duty. Cassie whispered, her voice trembling like brittle glass. The rented apartment's dim light flickered against her face, washing her features pale. She clutched the table's edge as if the splintered wood might anchor her. The woman who once glittered in sequin gowns now pleaded in a coat too thin for the November cold. I know I made mistakes, she stammered. But family should stand together. We need to rebuild. Please, for Daniel. For all of us. Her words hung in the stale air, desperate, cloying. They were no longer sharp daggers thrown across ballrooms. They were broken fragments of a pride that had collapsed in full view of the world. Across from her, Richard sat hunched shoulders, sagging, a man hollowed out by disgrace. His hands shook as he pressed them together. Finally, he raised his head just enough to meet my eyes. I failed, he murmured. His voice was sandpaper rough and stripped. As a businessman, as a father, as a man. It wasn't loud, but in that silence, the confession was thunder. Daniel stood between them, his eyes read his chest rising with uneven breaths. He looked at Cassie, then at me, torn in the same way he had been for months. But this time, there was no shield left for her, no excuses strong enough to bridge the chasm she had dug. Tears gathered at the corners of his eyes. He turned away from his wife, shoulders shaking, and for a moment he was the little boy again, the boy who clung to my hand outside his school gates, who cried when he thought I might not return. Now he was a surgeon, a man who saved lives daily, but he stood powerless against the wreckage of his own. Cassie reached for him. Daniel. He flinched back, covering his face with both hands. His silence said more than any sentence could. I let the pause settle long enough for the weight of it to crush the illusions still flickering inside that room. Then I leaned forward, my fingers brushing the cool handle of the silver teacup. Money can return, I said quietly, every syllable sharp as stone. Respect once lost, never. The words did not shout. They did not need to. They cut deeper because they were calm, because they were final. Cassie's mouth opened, but no sound came. Richard lowered his gaze again. His eyes wet his chest, sinking, as if the truth itself pressed him into the chair. Daniel lifted his head, tears streaking his cheeks. He looked at me not for permission, not for judgment, but for something steadier, for the boundary that had been missing in all the chaos. And I gave it to him. Family is not a mask you wear when it's convenient, I continued. It is not a word you use to cover betrayal. Family is built on respect, and when you strip that away, what's left isn't family. It's just noise. Cassie pressed her hands together, whispering prayers that would not rise. Richard exhaled a long, ragged sigh. Daniel wiped his eyes and nodded almost imperceptibly, but enough. The shift in the room was quiet, but absolute. I did not need to slam doors or raise my voice. The lesson was already written in the scarred wood of their table, in the silence after disgrace, in the hollow echo of their thanksgiving, without warmth. The silver teacup gleamed between us, a relic of patience, a witness to downfall. It had survived storms, auctions, betrayals. And now it stood where pride had crumbled, as constant as truth itself. For the first time that night, I took a sip, letting the warmth steady me. The taste was simple, ordinary, but in its simplicity, there was power. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance. Inside, all I heard was the silence of surrender, and I knew this chapter was no longer about wealth or revenge or empire. It was about respect, the one currency no fraud could counterfeit. Cassie's voice no longer echoed in my ears. Her pleas had ended the night I told her respect once lost never returns. Since then, silence had become her only answer. I did not chase her. I did not strike the final blow. Some people destroy themselves better than any enemy could. Richard retreated into shadows too, no longer the man who strutted across marble floors, but a figure who avoided eye contact in court corridors. The empire he once boasted of had been reduced to footnotes in bankruptcy papers. I could have pressed harder, taken every last piece of pride left in him. Instead, I let him keep what little remained. A shell of dignity, perhaps. Or maybe just the emptiness of consequence. Because I had learned something. Victory without boundaries is nothing but another form of cruelty. Daniel came to me one evening, months later. His eyes were tired, his scrubs still faintly stained from a long shift in the operating room. He lingered at my door, a man who could mend torn flesh, but not the fracture in his own heart. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said. His voice cracked, "for standing by when I should have stood for you, for letting Cassie's words weigh more than your silence." I reached for the silver teacup on my table, turned it slowly in my hands, let the cool metal press into my skin before answering. "I forgive you," I said. And I meant it. But forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. I leaned closer, my eyes steady. Love is not blind. It needs respect to survive. The sentence landed between us like a boundary line, drawn in clear ink. He nodded, though his shoulders trembled. We sat together, then sharing a quiet that was less about sorrow and more about recognition. Still, when he mentioned Cassie, his voice dipped, a flicker of pain crossed his face. A scar remained, and scars I knew never fully fade. In the weeks that followed, I chose not to rebuild palaces of vengeance, but to lay foundations of purpose. With Marcus Hale's help, I established the Michael Fund, a scholarship for engineering students named after the man who once handed me a sealed envelope on a rainy night, whispering, "Promise me never let them know." Each time I signed a document transferring money into that fund, the sound of the pen scratching across paper felt like music. It was not wealth returning to my pocket. It was hope spreading into futures I would never see. I attended the first award ceremony in a modest lecture hall, rows of young faces lit with nervous excitement. One girl clutched her certificate as if it were a lifeline. Another boy blinked back tears as he promised to make his parents proud. Watching them, I felt Michael beside me, his hand on mine, his voice soft. Keep your power silent until the world forces you to reveal it. The silver teacup sat in my bag that day, its weight a reminder of the journey. Daniel joined me at that ceremony. He stood quietly at the back, his eyes fixed not on me, but on the students. I knew what he was thinking, that his own choices had left scars too, that losing his marriage, no matter how poisoned, was still a loss. His eyes shone wet when one student thanked the fund for giving her a chance my family could never afford. He whispered to me afterward, "I wish my marriage had been built on that kind of respect." I squeezed his hand. Peace is never free. It always costs something. The words surprised even me, spoken aloud for the first time. But they were true. Every boundary drawn, every silence endured, every truth revealed, it all demanded a price. My peace had been bought with humiliation, with betrayal, with years of waiting for the right moment. Daniel's peace would cost him the ghost of a love he once believed in. We walked out of the hall together. Students waved. Flashbulbs flickered as reporters asked for quotes. But I held the teacup closer in my bag and said nothing. Because healing was never about noise. Healing was about the line between what must be remembered and what must be released. That night, I brewed tea in the silver cup, the steam rising like forgiveness itself. I lifted it not in victory, but in acknowledgement of the scar I carried, and the ones Daniel did too. Scars did not make us weaker. They reminded us where the fire had been, and that we had walked through it alive. And in that truth, I finally found the weight of respect. Cassie's voice no longer echoed in my ears. Her pleas had ended the night I told her respect, once lost, never returns. Since then, silence had become her only answer. I did not chase her. I did not strike the final blow. Some people destroy themselves better than any enemy could. Richard retreated into shadows too, no longer the man who strutted across marble floors, but a figure who avoided eye contact in court corridors. The empire he once boasted of had been reduced to footnotes in bankruptcy papers. I could have pressed harder, taken every last piece of pride left in him. Instead, I let him keep what little remained. A shell of dignity, perhaps. Or maybe just the emptiness of consequence. Because I had learned something. Victory without boundaries is nothing but another form of cruelty. Daniel came to me one evening, months later. His eyes were tired, his scrub still faintly stained from a long shift in the operating room. He lingered at my door, a man who could mend torn flesh, but not the fracture in his own heart. "I'm sorry, Mum," he said. His voice cracked. "For standing by when I should have stood for you. For letting Cassie's words weigh more than your silence." I reached for the silver teacup on my table, turned it slowly in my hands, let the cool metal press into my skin before answering. "I forgive you," I said. And I meant it. But forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. I leaned closer, my eyes steady. Love is not blind. It needs respect to survive. The sentence landed between us like a boundary line drawn in clear ink. He nodded though his shoulders trembled. We sat together, then sharing a quiet that was less about sorrow and more about recognition. Still, when he mentioned Cassie, his voice dipped, a flicker of pain crossed his face. A scar remained, and scars I knew never fully fade. In the weeks that followed, I chose not to rebuild palaces of vengeance, but to lay foundations of purpose. With Marcus Hale's help, I established the Michael Fund, a scholarship for engineering students, named after the man who once handed me a sealed envelope on a rainy night, whispering, "Promise me never let them know." Each time I signed a document, transferring money into that fund, the sound of the pen scratching across paper felt like music. It was not wealth returning to my pocket. It was hope spreading into futures I would never see. I attended the first awards ceremony in a modest lecture hall, rows of young faces lit with nervous excitement. One girl clutched her certificate as if it were a lifeline. Another boy blinked back tears as he promised to make his parents proud. Watching them, I felt Michael beside me, his hand on mine, his voice soft. Keep your power silent until the world forces you to reveal it. The silver teacup sat in my bag that day, its weight a reminder of the journey. Daniel joined me at that ceremony. He stood quietly at the back, his eyes fixed not on me, but on the students. I knew what he was thinking, that his own choices had left scars too, that losing his marriage, no matter how poisoned, was still a loss. His eyes shone wet when one student thanked the fund for giving her a chance my family could never afford. He whispered to me afterward, "I wish my marriage had been built on that kind of respect." I squeezed his hand. Peace is never free. It always costs something. The words surprised even me, spoken aloud for the first time. But they were true. Every boundary drawn, every silence endured, every truth revealed, it all demanded a price. My peace had been bought with humiliation, with betrayal, with years of waiting for the right moment. Daniel's peace would cost him the ghost of a love he once believed in. We walked out of the hall together. Students waved. Flashbulbs flickered as reporters asked for quotes. But I held the teacup closer in my bag and said nothing. Because healing was never about noise. Healing was about the line between what must be remembered and what must be released. That night I brewed tea in the silver cup, the steam rising like forgiveness itself. I lifted it not in victory, but in acknowledgement of the scar I carried, and the ones Daniel did too. Scars did not make us weaker. They reminded us where the fire had been, and that we had walked through it alive. And in that truth, I finally found the weight of respect. Morning light shimmered on the lake, like 1,000 small mirrors. I opened the back door of my cottage, the wooden boards creaking under my step, and carried the silver teacup into the cool air. The water rippled, as if whispering back my secrets. Every day began this way now. Not with chaos, not with boardrooms or crowded ballrooms, but with the steady pour of tea into the cup that had survived everything. The steam rose, curling like smoke from battles, past softening into something gentler. The cottage was small, tucked against a line of birch trees. No marble floors, no chandeliers, no echo of laughter turned cruel. Just pine-scented air, the hum of crickets at night, and a quiet strong enough to hold me steady. I sat on the porch, teacup in hand, and listened. For the first time in years, the silence was not loneliness. It was peace. Julia came by often now. The young waitress who had once overheard a single trembling word, boss, was no longer just a witness. She was a friend. That afternoon she brought fresh bread wrapped in cloth, her smile bright as sunlight. "You never look like someone who carried an empire," she teased, glancing at my cup. "Empires crumble," I said, sipping. "But peace can last." Marcus Hale visited 2 suit jackets slung casually over his arm, laughter easier than I had ever heard it. He no longer looked like the man constantly bracing for another courtroom ambush. He looked for once at ease. He stood by the railing with a hand in his pocket, watching the lake, as if it too had secrets to confess. And Lily, sweet Lily, ran barefoot through the garden, chasing dragonflies. Her giggles were the music this house had been waiting for. She picked wildflowers and placed them on the table beside my teacup, tiny offerings of innocence that needed no repayment. Daniel came less often. His schedule at the hospital left him weary, and the scars of his marriage still showed in his eyes. But when he did arrive, he stayed long enough to sit quietly by the lake, his shoulders finally easing. We did not always speak. Sometimes healing needs no words, only presence. One evening, as twilight painted the water in shades of silver, I raised the teacup and whispered to myself, "The real revenge is peace." It was not for Richard to hear, nor Cassie, nor even Daniel. It was for me. A declaration not of conquest, but of survival. A reminder that all the noise, all the humiliation, all the betrayals had ended here, distilled into this quiet lake, this small cottage, this silver cup. Peace, yes, but never free. The wind shifted, carrying the sound of Lily's laughter. Julia called her back. Marcus chuckled, and I sat still holding onto the cup. I let the warmth press into my palms, the same way Michael once had pressed that envelope into my hands on a stormy night, whispering, "Promise me never let them know." I had kept the promise. And when the world forced me to reveal it, I had done so on my terms. Now, as I looked out across the water, I realized the cup was no longer just Michael's. It was mine. It was Lily's. It was every viewer, every listener who carried this story away with them. A symbol that dignity can outlast mockery, that quiet strength can topple the loudest cruelty. So I ask you listening now, if your own family mocked you, would you stay silent or fight back? Tell me in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe, because these stories matter. They remind us that silence can be strength, and that the true revenge is never destruction, it is peace. The camera would fade here if this were a film. The screen would hold the image of the teacup catching the last golden light of the day, steam-rising music softening. But your story continues, wherever respect is demanded, wherever boundaries are drawn. Because the silver teacup does not belong only to me anymore. It belongs to anyone who refuses to let cruelty have the last word. And so my journey closes, not in fury, but in quiet peace. The silver teacup that traveled with me through humiliation, through boardrooms, through betrayals, now rests in my hands as the symbol of something greater. It reminds me that true power isn't in shouting louder than your enemies, but in standing tall with dignity even when the room laughs at you. This was never only about wealth or inheritance. It was about respect, about drawing boundaries, about choosing peace over chaos. And as I sip my tea in the quiet of my new home, I know the real victory is not what was taken from others, but what was preserved within myself. If this story spoke to you, take a moment to reflect. Have you ever been mocked, underestimated, or betrayed by those closest to you? What did you do? Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories of family drama, quiet revenge, and emotional justice. Thank you for being here. Until the next story, remember, the real revenge is peace.